Have you ever stopped to think about the power of a single decision? The impact that one choice can have, not just on your life, but on the generations that will come after you. And what if the decision you make, driven by fear or hurry, changes not only your own history, but the future of many other people over time? The story of Lot's daughters is a powerful example of how, in a moment of desperation and loneliness, an extreme choice sealed a tragic fate that would echo for centuries. What happened there wasn't just a single mistake, but a decision that reverberated through time, affecting their lives and the lives of an entire people. Often, when we think about impulsive decisions, we believe they won't have big consequences. But what happens when that choice is so drastic that even regret can't change the course of events? And the most challenging part, what happens when fear leads us to act in a way that, looking back, we can clearly see wasn't the best path? The fate of Lot's daughters teaches us exactly this. Their actions, driven by the pressure of the moment and fear, echoed through generations, changing destinies in a way they could never have predicted. The truth is that at some point in life, we all face a crisis that pushes us to make quick decisions, without thinking about the consequences. However, what this story reveals is that there is always an opportunity to reflect, regret, and seek a path of redemption. Are we ready to make conscious choices, even in the toughest situations? Or like Lot's daughters, will we be swept away by fear and haste, creating consequences that could have been avoided? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most impactful stories in the Bible, serving as a deep warning about the power of moral and spiritual choices. These two cities were so steeped in corruption and wickedness that they became symbols of impurity. When sin surpasses all limits, God's judgment becomes inevitable. Looking at the world today, we see societies that often stumble into the same mistakes. The decay of values and the disregard for morals are still present realities, and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that no matter how much time passes, certain choices continue to bring irreversible consequences. The fire and sulfur that rained down on these cities were not just an expression of divine anger, but a response to the accumulation of wrong actions. It was like a snowball that grew uncontrollably until it was no longer possible to stop. Sometimes, we too become victims of our own choices, which build up without us noticing until the moment we face the final consequence. But it's essential to understand that, even in the face of this devastation, the opportunity to start over was always there, available to those brave enough to change. The question is, are we aware enough to act before things get out of control? Amid the chaos and destruction, one figure survives: Lot. He was at the heart of it all, yet managed to escape. Even though he lived in a corrupt city, he had the chance to start over. This is a crucial point. No matter how dark our current situation may seem, there is always an opportunity to begin again, even when everything seems lost. In one way or another, we've all found ourselves in a place where options seemed scarce, and the only way out was to move forward, even without knowing what the future held. When Lot and his daughters escaped, they were faced with a devastating scenario. They believed the world had been destroyed, that no one would be left to rebuild civilization. In times of crisis, fear becomes a constant companion. It's not hard to understand how fear took over them. The feeling of being completely alone in the world, not knowing what to do, is something we've all experienced at some point. So what happened? Fear created a sense of urgency, a feeling that action had to be taken quickly, without thinking about the consequences. This is an important lesson. Panic can lead us to make rash decisions that deeply affect our lives and the lives of others. When Lot and his daughters fled, it felt like time had stopped. There were no more references to rebuild a future, to move forward. The fear of losing everything and being completely alone created a state of uncertainty and despair. Who hasn't found themselves in a situation where the only option seemed to be to act, even without fully understanding what they were doing? This state of panic can blind us to what really matters, leading us to make hasty decisions without weighing the consequences. Lot and his daughters were in an extreme situation, but what the story of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us is that choices carry weight. When a society moves away from its principles, the results can be devastating, as happened with those cities. And while this is a story of destruction, it also carries an important lesson about the need to reflect on the actions we take, both individually and collectively. What do we see around us? Are we by any chance moving away from what truly matters? This reflection is essential, as it can help us avoid the same tragic end. We cannot fool ourselves into thinking that our actions are insignificant. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that every choice has its consequences. What we do, how we live, and how we treat others has a real impact. We cannot allow selfishness, indifference, and a lack of empathy to guide our decisions. The destruction of these cities is a reflection of the disregard for these fundamental values. However, it is also an invitation to reflect on our own choices. There is always time to change, even when the path seems difficult. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, but in the midst of all the tragedy, there is always a lesson we can apply to our lives. No matter how desolate a situation may be, there is always an opportunity to start over. Fear and despair should not be the guides of our decisions, but wisdom and reflection should. The story of these cities reminds us that more than just a desire for change is needed. It requires action, a change in attitude, and the trust that there is a better path, even after the darkest moments. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters, seemingly the last survivors of humanity, sought shelter in a cave. Imagine the scene, a devastated land with no cities, friends, or acquaintances. It was a desert of hopelessness, a deep emptiness that took over their souls. They were alone without direction, believing humanity had been wiped out forever. This kind of extreme loneliness is hard to imagine, but in some way, we've all experienced moments where we felt lost and directionless. Lot, at that moment, was probably asking himself, "What will become of us now?" This moment of fleeing to the cave is, in a way, a metaphor for the crises we all face in our lives. Sometimes, when everything around us collapses, we seek refuge, whether physical, emotional, or even spiritual, but often that refuge ends up becoming a prison. Lot and his daughters were physically safe, but their minds were trapped by doubt and fear. How many of us have sought refuges that, instead of helping us, end up isolating us even more from the solutions we need? When pain and uncertainty hit, the temptation to run toward what is familiar can be irresistible. However, that temporary refuge can be the worst place for our emotional and mental health. The cave, for Lot and his daughters, seemed to be the last safe place. In a destroyed world, what else could they do? Escaping destruction, they believed they would find some kind of peace there. But like any place of isolation, the cave didn't offer answers to their dilemmas. In real life, the feeling of loneliness in difficult times is inevitable. Often when we face crises, isolation seems like the only alternative. However, this isolation can make us forget that we are not alone. Even when everything seems to fall apart, there is always a way to rediscover hope, whether through faith, the support of friends, or seeking help. That feeling of being lost without direction or purpose is deeply human. How many times in our own lives have we gone through moments of hopelessness when we believed everything was lost and there was no future? The story of Lot and his daughters, though extreme, is a lesson in how crises can make us see the world in a much darker way than it really is. No matter how difficult it may be, we must remember that the cave, while offering temporary protection, is not the place we should stay. Fear and doubt are natural, but they should not stop us from looking for a path toward light and overcoming. During the time they spent in the cave, Lot and his daughters were immersed in a growing sense of despair. The idea that humanity had been wiped out plunged them into deep sadness. They were alone in a devastated world, which made them question even the purpose of their existence. This kind of existential crisis is not rare. When we face intense hardships, we often feel so disconnected from the world that we start to doubt our very existence. The secret lies in understanding that these moments of crisis do not define who we are, but rather how we choose to react to them. Lot, in his anguish, didn't know what would come next, but the future was still ahead of him despite everything. Looking at Lot and his daughter's cave, we can see how the fear of death and loss can blind us to what we still have. Extreme loneliness and the loss of everything we know are experiences that we all face in some form throughout our lives. However, just like Lot and his daughters, We always have the option to leave our own refuges, even when it seems the world has fallen apart. It's possible to start again with courage, faith, and one step at a time. The key is realizing that the cave, while comfortable and safe in times of crisis, is not the place where we should stay forever. This refuge in the cave leads us to reflect on how much we need the company of others to overcome difficulties. Lot and his daughters were alone, and that only increased the weight of the fear they felt. We, as human beings, were made for companionship. When we are isolated, whether by choice or circumstances, the weight of despair tends to grow. Lot's story reminds us of the importance of connections. Even in the hardest moments, it's essential to seek support, whether from others or from our own faith. Isolation should not be a permanent solution, but rather a moment of reflection before we move forward. And although the cave was the last refuge Lot found, it also became a turning point. In the midst of fear and uncertainty, he didn't know he was about to make a decision that would change the course of his story. What this part of the story teaches us is that even when it seems like we're at rock bottom, the decision to move forward or stay in fear is ours. And often, it's the courage to leave the cave that gives us a new chance to start over, even in an apparently destroyed world. When Lot and his daughters took refuge in the cave, the fear of a future without humanity consumed them. The belief that they were the last people on earth created a deep despair. They feared that the human race was doomed to extinction, as there was no one left to perpetuate the species. This fear of losing continuity led to an absurd yet understandable idea in the context they were in. They needed to ensure descendants, the survival of the human race no matter the cost. The pressure of the moment, combined with panic and loneliness, led them to a decision that defied all moral principles. When we find ourselves in extreme situations, fear often drives us to thoughtless choices. Just like Lot's daughters, many of us in times of crisis end up making decisions based on panic, without reflecting on the consequences. Logic tends to fade, and what once seemed impossible becomes a viable option in a state of desperation. Often, impulsive choices, driven by primal instincts, can cause irreversible harm to ourselves and others. This is a dangerous trap that we often ignore until it's too late. Lot's daughter's plan involved getting their father drunk, causing him to lose his senses. To them, it seemed like the only solution to ensure the continuity of humanity. When we are dominated by fear, it's easy to lose clarity and perspective. They were convinced that without children, there would be no future. The need for survival can lead us to act in ways that, in other circumstances, would be completely unacceptable. And that's the greatest risk of despair. It distorts our vision and makes us believe that any act, no matter how wrong, is justifiable. This episode teaches us an important lesson about the risks of hasty decisions. When panic takes over, we are often led to act without considering the consequences. Thoughtless actions often generate irreversible consequences. In this case, Lot's daughter's choice not only broke moral values, but also created a cycle of conflicts and divisions that lasted for generations. The story of their actions shows us how fear, when not reflected upon, can create damage that affects future generations. How many conflicts and difficult situations in our society are reflections of impulsive choices made in the past? The idea that Lot's daughters were securing the continuity of a lineage seemed, in their eyes, like a practical decision. But in reality, this action led to the creation of two peoples who would become Israel's relentless enemies, the Moabites and the Ammonites. From a desperate attempt to perpetuate the species, the foundation of a rivalry was born that would last for centuries. The lesson here is clear. Often hasty decisions do not bring the expected result. Instead of providing a solution, they generate even bigger problems that multiply over time. When we reflect on this story, it's hard to understand how anyone could make such a drastic decision. However, it's important to remember that in our own lives, when we make impulsive decisions based solely on emotions and fears, we end up creating situations that are even more complicated than the initial problem. This leads us to reflect. How many times have we acted without thinking about the consequences, only to realize later that the impact was far greater than we imagined? The story of Lot's daughters serves as a reminder that we must evaluate the consequences before acting. Fear can make us believe that there are no more options, but in reality, we always have the power to choose how to react. Lot's daughters, in their desperation, chose the path of impulsive action, but we can learn from this story the importance of pausing and reflecting before making decisions. Fear should not be the engine behind our choices. Wisdom and trust in the fact that a better future lies ahead should be. As the story progresses, we see the impact of Lot's daughter's decision, revealing how one action, no matter how desperate, led to consequences that would extend for generations. After the desperate plan of Lot's daughters, something very significant happened: the birth of Moab and Benami. These two sons, the product of an incestuous relationship, became the ancestors of two peoples who, throughout history, became enemies of Israel. Moab, the older son, and Benami, the younger, represented the continuation of a lineage born out of the desperate need for survival. But instead of being a blessing, it led to a series of conflicts and rivalries. It's interesting how when human nature is pushed to its limits, we try to find solutions, but often these solutions end up creating more problems than they resolve. This birth, which came from an unthinkable and wrong situation, carried with it a legacy of tension and antagonism. The Moabites and Ammonites, descendants of Moab and Benami, became frequent enemies of Israel, going to war with them multiple times. What began as a desperate attempt to ensure the continuity of humanity turned into a cycle of hatred and violence between nations. This leads us to reflect on the power of our decisions. Often, what we begin with good intentions, or under the pressure of a difficult situation, can result in outcomes completely different from, and even opposite to, what we desired. It almost seems ironic, doesn't it? The idea that a decision driven by fear and the need to preserve a lineage ended up creating a lineage of enemies. This serves as a powerful warning about the long-term consequences of our actions. When we are faced with a crisis, it is easy to think that any action is justifiable. But as the story of Moab and Benami shows us, an impulsive decision can have a much greater impact than we imagine, affecting not only our own life, but also the lives of future generations. When we look at the history of the Moabites and Ammonites, we see that this rivalry with Israel wasn't just a series of military conflicts, but a deep struggle that affected the morals and spirit of God's people. The Moabites, with their worship of gods like Chemosh, and the Ammonites with Molech, were people marked by idolatry and the perversion of sacred principles. These pagan cults, which included practices like human sacrifices, directly influenced the life and morality of Israel. Thus, the birth of Moab and Benami not only perpetuated a lineage, but also perpetuated a cycle of spiritual corruption. In our own lives, we are constantly challenged to reflect on the decisions we make. How many times in the face of momentary pressure have we found ourselves doing something that deep down we know isn't right? The birth of Moab and Benami reminds us that our actions have far-reaching consequences. A wrong choice, driven by fear or the desire for control, can lead to outcomes that we can't always predict, affecting not only our lives, but also the lives of others for generations. What we can learn here is that when making important decisions, we must always consider the long-term repercussions. The story of Moab and Benami is not just a story of war and rivalry, but a lesson on how choices made under pressure can take root deeply and lastingly. It's important to cultivate a deeper awareness of the actions we take and their potential consequences, especially when the temptation to act impulsively calls us. Looking at this story, we see that the birth of Moab and Benami was not an isolated event, but the result of a series of decisions that culminated in a legacy of enemies and conflicts. This reminds us that peace and harmony, both personal and collective, are not just the fruits of good intentions, but also of careful and thoughtful choices. Lot's daughters, in their desperate attempt to ensure a future, created a cycle of hostility that would last for generations, affecting the history of Israel. This story leads us to question how, in our own lives, small decisions can turn into significant milestones in the future. The birth of Moab and Benami illustrates the idea that what we begin with hopelessness and without reflection can result in something much harder to deal with in the future. And that is why, before acting in moments of pressure, we need to stop, reflect, and act with wisdom, so that we do not sow something that will bring consequences far greater than we can imagine. The Moabites and Ammonites, descendants of Moab and Benami, became persistent enemies of Israel throughout history. After the birth of Moab and Benami, the rivalry between these peoples and Israel began to intensify. On several occasions, the Moabites attacked the people of Israel, and the tension between them only grew. What seemed like a decision for survival in the mountains for Lot and his daughters ended up creating an enmity that would last for generations. This conflict was not only about territorial disputes, but also a spiritual and moral battle that divided God's people and the descendants of Lot. In moments of conflict, history teaches us that the roots of the problem are not always in immediate actions, but in deeper origins. The conflict between Israel and the Moabites and Ammonites was not just about land or resources, but about values and beliefs. The rivalry that started with the birth of Moab and Benami manifested intensely because, at its core, it was a struggle over morality and true worship. While Israel sought to follow God's commandments, the Moabites and Ammonites worshipped pagan gods, such as Chemosh and Molech, whose cults involved cruel practices like human sacrifices. Thus, what started as a thoughtless choice in a cave quickly transformed into an eternal conflict. What's most fascinating about this story is how ancient conflicts still reverberate in the modern world. Often our disputes do not have a superficial root, but are fueled by much deeper issues, such as differences in values, beliefs, and identities. Just as the Moabites and Ammonites represented a continuous threat to Israel, today we face internal and external battles that are driven by deeply rooted principles and worldviews. How many times in our lives do we find ourselves in conflicts with those around us due to a fundamental difference in how we view the world? This happens both on a personal and social level when our value choices clash. The constant attacks by the Moabites and Ammonites on Israel can be seen as a metaphor for the battles we face in our spiritual and emotional lives. Sometimes we find ourselves in internal and external wars that seem never-ending. Like the people of Israel, we are often attacked for what we believe in and the values we uphold. And just as Israel had to resist and fight against its enemies, we are also challenged to fight for our beliefs and principles, even when surrounded by forces trying to bring us down. This ongoing rivalry also teaches us about cycles of hatred and revenge. The story of Israel with the Moabites and Ammonites is not just about physical battles, but reveals how hatred and hostility can be perpetuated through generations. What started with a wrong choice in a cave became a cycle of attacks and resentments that would extend for centuries. This reminds us that in our own lives, anger and resentment, if left unchecked and unhealed, can create an endless cycle of destruction. How many times, by holding on to hatred in our hearts, have we allowed it to affect our future decisions, creating more divisions and wounds? The struggle between Israel and the Moabites and Ammonites also reveals the importance of discerning when and how to act in times of conflict. Israel was constantly challenged by its enemies, but in many situations, God's people had to learn to fight with wisdom, justice, and obedience to divine will. This teaches us that in our own conflicts, we should not act impulsively or driven only by anger. Instead, we should seek divine guidance, discern our steps, and take actions aligned with what is just and right, not just with what seems like the immediate solution. We must not forget that the story of Israel with the Moabites and Ammonites also reflects an important principle about spiritual warfare. The battle against wrong values, harmful ideologies, and enemies of faith is a battle that continues to be fought in many aspects of our daily lives. The hostility between Israel and these pagan peoples is not just an ancient story, but an illustration of the spiritual battles we constantly face. In our walk, we must be aware of these battles and fight wisely so that we can remain firm in our beliefs and the principles we know to be true. The Moabites and Ammonites, descendants of Moab and Benami, had a striking characteristic: the practice of pagan worship, particularly the worship of gods like Chemosh and Molech. These cults were not merely religious practices, but were deeply rooted in the cultures of these peoples, based on rituals involving horrific practices such as human sacrifices. The worship of Chemosh, for example, required the offering of children as sacrifices, believing that this would ensure blessings and prosperity. In a context where morality was constantly challenged, these cults served as a direct affront to the principles that Israel was supposed to follow, fueling a spiritual tension that never dissipated. Idolatry and pagan worship were not just alternative beliefs. They were a direct threat to the moral and spiritual integrity of the people of Israel. When Israel began to engage with these gods and rituals, the influence of the Moabites and Ammonites began to corrode the very essence of God's people. It was as if a negative current of spiritual influence infiltrated, contaminating the purity of their faith and distorting the principles of justice, mercy, and respect for life. Idolatry is not just the worship of false gods, but the exchange of what is pure and true for something empty and destructive. In our own lives, we are constantly challenged by external influences that try to divert our attention from what truly matters. We don't need pagan cults for idolatry to manifest. Anything that pulls us away from our deepest principles and leads us to worship or give more importance to something or someone that isn't essential for our peace and happiness becomes a form of idolatry. It could be money, status, the relentless pursuit of pleasure, or even toxic relationships that pull us away from our true purpose. The lesson here is clear. We must be mindful of the influences we allow into our lives. In the context of Israel, the influence of the Moabites and Ammonites was not just external but also internal. God's people began adopting pagan practices, believing that these worships could bring immediate benefits. However, these practices only brought disgrace and destruction. The temptation to follow the ways of the world, to seek shortcuts, or adopt behaviors that don't align with our values will always be present. Israel's history teaches us that these external influences will never bring us true success or happiness. On the contrary, they take us away from the real peace that comes from living according to our highest principles. In the modern world, idolatry may not involve the worship of ancient gods, but it manifests in various forms. When we give ourselves entirely to something without substance, whether an obsessive passion for something material or the relentless pursuit of status, we end up trading our inner peace for something fleeting and empty. What the people of Israel experienced by engaging with the pagan worship of the Moabites and Ammonites reflects how we stray from our core values. What truly matters is not what the world offers superficially, but the connection to what is eternal and unchanging. Idolatry does not only affect our relationship with God, but also with others. When we prioritize the temporary, we neglect what truly builds a legacy of peace, love, and harmony in our lives. Israel's story serves as a warning against this exchange. The constant struggle against pagan cults and idolatry reveals that the greatest enemy of true well-being is the pursuit of something that never satisfies us, something that robs us of the essence of who we are. Therefore, the story of Israel, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and their pagan cults teaches us a fundamental lesson. We must be vigilant about the influences around us. We cannot allow external ideals to corrupt our faith, our values, and most importantly, our hearts. We must make choices that bring us closer to true peace and happiness, those that come from a life aligned with our deepest principles and a sincere connection with the divine. The story of idolatry reminds us of the importance of maintaining our integrity, not being led astray by the temptations of the world. The influence of the Moabites and Ammonites on Israel was one of the greatest spiritual and moral challenges the people of God faced throughout their history. The worship of gods like Chemosh and Molech, with their impure rituals and horrific practices, such as human sacrifices, was not just a religious matter, but a direct threat to Israel's moral and spiritual identity. When the Israelites began to engage with these pagan cults, they started to lose sight of what really mattered, the purity of their faith and the values that sustained them as a nation. The external influence was corrosive, undermining the foundation of their spirituality. This process of spiritual contamination did not happen overnight. Like many external influences, that of Moab and Ammon was gradual. Initially, the Israelites may have seen the pagan cults as fascinating or as a way to gain favor from foreign gods. However, as time passed, this interaction with idolatry slowly began to corrupt the essence of the nation of Israel. The danger of external influence is that it starts with small concessions. and before we know it, we are drifting away from what is true and pure. This silent infiltration is like a current that carries us further from the shore until we can no longer return. In our modern society, we are surrounded by influences that constantly try to shape the way we think and act. The world we live in constantly invites us to follow values that do not align with our deepest principles. Unrestrained consumerism, the relentless pursuit of fame and wealth, social pressures to conform to certain standards. These are all forms of modern idolatry. These modern gods do not demand human sacrifices, but they require something equally precious: our inner peace, our integrity, and our true identity. Just as Israel was influenced, we too are constantly challenged to keep our faith and values firm, even in the face of external pressures. However, negative influence is not limited to external pressures. Often the greatest battle we face is internal. Just as Israel allowed itself to be influenced by the cultures around it, we too often allow our own weaknesses and desires to pull us away from the right path. The history of Israel with the Moabites and Ammonites teaches us that spiritual vulnerability often arises from a lack of vigilance over our own intentions and actions. When we begin to stray from our principles, the impact is much deeper than we realize. We must be aware of what we are allowing into our lives so we are not contaminated by negative influences. This battle against both external and internal influence is constant. Every day we must decide whether to follow the paths that lead us to true peace or to give in to temptations that pull us away from it. Israel throughout its history fought this battle, and the consequences of yielding to the influence of the Moabites and Ammonites were devastating. The wars, spiritual corruption, and suffering that followed could have been avoided had God's people kept their faith firm. The lesson we can take from this is that, in our own lives, constant vigilance over our choices is essential to avoid being contaminated by negative influences. Although the people of Israel were significantly influenced by pagan cults, there were also moments of great spiritual awakening. Men and women of faith arose throughout Israel's history to confront these idols and restore focus on the true God. The story of Ruth, for example, is a beautiful example of how someone, even coming from a pagan lineage, can break away from false gods and turn toward true worship. This shows us that no matter how strong the external pressure, there is always the possibility to break free from error and return to the right path. No matter where we come from or what we face, repentance and transformation are always within our reach. The influence of the Moabites and Ammonites also brought harsh lessons about the consequences of idolatry. When Israel turned away from God and became involved with these cults, defeats and spiritual crises became inevitable. What this teaches us is that our choices shape our reality. If we allow negative influences to govern our lives, we will end up reaping bitter fruit. Therefore, it is essential to keep our faith and values aligned with what we know to be truly important and eternal. The story of Ruth is one of the most touching and redemptive in the Bible, especially when we consider her origins. She was a Moabite, a descendant of Moab, a people born from an unthoughtful choice that over time became an enemy of Israel. However, Ruth, unlike many in her land, made a different choice. She abandoned her pagan gods and joined the God of Israel. Her decision not only transformed her life, but also became a landmark in the history of God's people. What she did was a true spiritual revolution. Instead of following the path of idolatry, she chose true worship, becoming part of God's redemptive plan. This change in Ruth's life teaches us much about the choices we make. She could have easily followed the path of her culture, continuing to worship Chemosh and other Moabite gods, but she chose to follow the God of Israel. What did this decision mean for her? Ruth chose solitude and the loss of her cultural identity for something greater, something she believed to be true. In our own lives, we often face difficult choices, where we follow familiar and comfortable paths or risk stepping away from what is safe and known to follow what we believe is right, even if it is not easy. Ruth's story challenges us to reflect on the courage needed to make decisions that can not only change our lives, but also our legacy. Ruth was not only a woman of faith, but also of action. She didn't just decide to follow God. She demonstrated it through her actions. She worked in the fields of Boaz, a man who would become her husband, and showed humility, courage, and dedication, caring for her mother-in-law Naomi and providing for her family. This teaches us that true faith is not just an internal belief, but is manifested in our daily actions. It's easy to say we follow a path of faith, but our actions truly reveal if we are committed to change and divine purpose. Like Ruth, we need to be bold in our decisions and commitments, confident that when we act with faith, God will guide us. What's fascinating about Ruth's story is that by breaking away from her old gods, she didn't just move away from something negative, but drew closer to something much greater, God's plan for her life and for the world. Ruth didn't know what the future held, but she trusted God, and this led her to become the great-grandmother of King David, and thus an ancestor of Jesus Christ. This lesson is crucial. Our decisions today can not only affect our lives, but also impact future generations. Ruth not only secured a legacy for herself, but she became an essential part of God's salvation plan for the entire world. Every choice we make can, in some way, touch the lives of others, especially when we align our actions with God's greater purpose. Ruth's story also highlights the importance of redemption and forgiveness. By marrying Boaz, she not only found stability, but was redeemed from the pagan lineage of the Moabites. Through this marriage, she entered the line of God's promise to Israel, and from her descendants came King David. This reminds us that no matter our past or the circumstances we were born into, we all have the opportunity to be redeemed and be part of something greater. Ruth is living proof that God's mercy is greater than any mistake or failure of the past. No matter where we come from or what we have done, redemption is always within our reach if we choose to follow God with all our hearts. This story is also a call for us to reflect on how our decisions can impact the future, either positively or negatively. What Ruth did by leaving her land and her gods was an act of courage, but also trust. She knew that her decision would not be easy, but she trusted that by following God's path, something greater awaited her. In the same way, in our lives, we often need to take the first step in faith, even when we don't know exactly where it will lead us. The future may be uncertain, but trust in God is the key to transforming any situation. By making this decision, Ruth not only changed the course of her life, but also the course of history. Today, she is remembered as an example of faith and obedience, a woman who chose to trust in God, even in the face of adversity. Her story is a reminder that our choices have power, and that when we turn to God, He transforms our lives in ways we could never imagine. Sometimes our greatest victories come from following the path that seems hardest, but which leads us to something far greater than we could have predicted. The story of Lot's daughters teaches us a valuable lesson about the consequences of hasty decisions made under pressure and motivated by fear. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, they were in a state of utter despair. Not knowing what else to do, they made the drastic decision to get Lot drunk and sleep with him to ensure the continuity of the human lineage. This act, driven by the urgency to preserve humanity, was a thoughtless choice that brought devastating consequences for future generations. How many times in our own lives have we made impulsive decisions when fear and panic took over us? Fear is a powerful emotion, capable of making us act without considering the repercussions. In the case of Lot's daughters, the fear that humanity might be extinct led them to a radical decision, which in a moment of crisis seemed like the only viable solution. Often, when we are in desperate situations, we forget to consider that God's timing and actions are perfect, and we end up making decisions that in the long run may be irreversible. The rush to resolve a situation, especially when we are emotionally involved, often leads us to shortcuts. However, these shortcuts can result in winding paths and consequences we never imagined. The story of Lot and his daughters is a clear example of this. The decisions we make in moments of anguish, driven by the urgency to solve everything quickly, may cause more pain and regret than we expect. If we could stop for a moment, reflect on the consequences, and trust God's timing, we could avoid decisions that would place us in even more complicated situations. When we think about hasty decisions, it's easy to remember moments when we felt pressured to act quickly, without taking the time to think. However, the lesson that Lot's daughters teach us is that fear should not guide our choices. When we let the urgency of the moment take over, we can lose sight of what truly matters and what God may be preparing for us. God's timing may not be our timing, but it is in His timing that we find peace and wisdom to deal with the challenges of life. What we often lack in moments of crisis is trust. Lot's daughters acted because they were desperate, believing that there was no more time and that the world was collapsing around them. They didn't realize that they could trust in God, that there was a greater plan for them, a plan that didn't require hasty decisions. Many times, desperation blinds us to the fact that God, in His perfect timing, makes things happen the right way. When we trust in divine timing, we can face any crisis with peace in our hearts, without the need to race against the clock. Impulsive decisions can bring harm not only to those who make them, but to everyone around them. When Lot's daughters chose to act quickly without reflection, they not only impacted their own lives, but also created a legacy of enemies for the people of Israel. This type of consequence can be avoided if we learn to act with wisdom and patience. The actions we take, even when they seem to be the only immediate solution, always bring effects that can last for generations. The deepest lesson this story teaches us is about the importance of trusting in God's timing. Often, we don't understand why certain things happen in our lives, and in the fear of the unknown, we make hasty decisions. However, if we stop and reflect, we'll see that God is always in control, even when everything seems out of control. The secret is in trusting that He knows what is best for us, and that the answers we seek will come at the right time. Rushing can be the greatest mistake because we cannot anticipate God's plans. In times of crisis, the rush can lead us to decisions that disregard the principles God has for our lives. The story of Lot's daughters warns us about the dangers of giving in to panic and impulsiveness. Making a decision without considering the consequences can cause us to stray from the right path, creating problems that could have been avoided with more patience and reflection. What God expects from us is not haste, but trust in His direction. When we trust His plans, even in times of pain and uncertainty, we find the wisdom to act in the right way. Finally, the lesson of hasty decisions is an invitation to reflect on the choices we make, especially in moments of crisis. Fear can be a powerful motivator, but it should never be the only force guiding our decisions. When we trust in God's timing, we learn to wait, to seek His guidance, and to act with patience. Lot's daughters, in their desperation, couldn't see the value of waiting for God's plan, and this led them to a fate of pain and regret. The message to us is clear: do not let fear dictate your actions. Instead, trust in God and His perfect timing. The story of Lot's daughters leads us to a deep reflection on the choices we make in our lives and the impact those choices have on future generations. Often we think our actions are only about us, that we are the only ones who will be affected by the decisions we make. However, the truth is that every choice, every step we take has the power to shape the legacy we leave behind. When we look at Lot's daughters, we see how their decision, made in desperation and with the rush to secure a future, not only affected their lives, but the entire history of Israel. By making decisions without reflecting, Lot's daughters not only created a cycle of enmity, but also perpetuated a legacy of conflict between their descendants and the people of Israel. This leads us to ask, are we truly aware of the consequences of our choices? In moments of desperation, we may be tempted to make quick decisions without imagining the impact they could have in the future. Every action we take can reverberate far beyond what we can see. The legacy we leave is not only a reflection of what we've done, but also of what we chose not to do. But of course, the story doesn't end in error. Repentance and seeking God have the power to transform any situation, regardless of past choices. Just like Lot's daughters, we all can make mistakes. The key, however, lies in our ability to reflect on those mistakes and seek redemption. God offers the chance to start over and correct what has been done because He is a God of mercy. The story teaches us that even when the past weighs heavily upon us, there is always the possibility for change and renewal. Reflecting on our choices also leads us to think about the legacy we are building. We are shaping our lives and the lives of others through the actions we take, often in subtle ways. The impact of our choices goes beyond our own existence. For example, how will our children, friends, or even strangers be affected by what we decide to do or not do? The legacy we leave can be a reflection of our wisdom, our faith, or conversely, of our fears and shortcomings. Therefore, it is essential to reflect on our choices and consider what we are transmitting to the world. It's important to recognize that, just as errors can perpetuate, repentance and the desire for change also have transformative power. True repentance, accompanied by a sincere seeking of God, can alter the course of our lives and bear fruit of peace and blessings for future generations. When we turn to God, He offers us the opportunity to write a new chapter. The legacy we leave can be one of redemption and hope, no matter what has happened before. However, reflection on our legacy is not limited to big choices, but also to the small daily gestures. Every attitude, every word, every decision we make contributes to the story we are building. If Lot's daughters had reflected better on the impact of their actions at that moment, they might have made different choices. The same goes for us. Every moment in our life is an opportunity to build a legacy of wisdom, love, and faith. Don't wait for a major crisis to reflect on your choices. Start now by making decisions that will positively impact your future and that of others. The story of Lot and his daughters also teaches us that even when something seems lost or damaged in the past, it's always possible to rebuild. Redemption is within reach for all those who repent and seek God's guidance. What seems like an irreparable mistake can be transformed into a testimony of overcoming and faith. No matter how much we've failed, it's never too late to return and change the course of our story. The legacy you can leave is that of someone who learned from their mistakes and turned to God, bringing with them the transformation and power of a new beginning. Reflection on legacy is a call to all of us. We are writing our story with every decision. By taking the time to reflect on our actions, we can ensure that the legacy we leave will be one of hope, wisdom, and faith. No matter what has happened so far, what really matters is how we choose to move forward from here. Repentance and seeking God can transform our story, bringing with it the power of a fresh start. When we reflect on the choices made by Lot's daughters, we are confronted with an essential question. What is the impact of our decisions, not only on our own lives, but also on the generations to come? Fear and desperation can lead us to impulsive and hasty decisions, but their story teaches us that even in the most difficult moments, we can always trust in God's timing and make wiser choices. Repentance and sincere seeking of God can bring true redemption, no matter how difficult the path has been up to this point. Now, I invite you to reflect. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where fear led you to make a decision that later you wished you could reverse? What did you learn from that? How can you apply that lesson to your future choices? Every decision we make leaves a legacy, and our legacy can be transformed if we choose to act with wisdom, patience, and faith. As we reflect on this story, we are reminded that the choices we make today not only shape our future, but also the future of those around us. And now, how about reflecting more deeply on your decisions? Have you been practicing patience and trust in God's timing in your life? Don't let fear and haste guide you. Make choices with wisdom and always seek divine guidance. If this video touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning and reflecting on the lessons that can transform your life. Change begins with a conscious decision, and you have the power to choose your future.